First of all, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. First of all, I want to dedicate today's talk to another local historian, Anne Godden, who sadly died on Wednesday, and she was an expert on Hull Charterhouse, amongst other things, and she will be sadly missed. So I'm going to talk about what I've found from the Hull and East Yorkshire History Calendar, which is a thing that I do online. Each day it pops up events that have happened on that calendar date in previous years. And what I've found about women. So as you see, Virginia Woolf's comment about anonymous being a woman, there are women there who are not mentioned as women. The Victorian historian Thomas Carlyle said, "Universal history, the history of what man has accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of the great men who have worked here. We're no longer content to ignore the lives of ordinary people in history, and we shouldn't assume that the lives of women were unimportant any more than those of working class people." So is, as the great modern sage Wikipedia says, women earning wages a modern phenomenon? I don't think so. But when we think about employment in history, we do tend to generalize. Women were mainly employed in the home, yes? Recent research shows that women in the past often had different occupations from their husband. Before and into the 20th century, women were doing housework, but mostly for other people. How about women and men did different types of work? Women are found in skilled and unskilled occupations, but were excluded from some, such as whaling, and at some points in history, tailoring. Just as the history of wars is told by the victors, much of history has been written in the past by men, and often written as though women spent their time bearing children and keeping house. So, hello? Right. Alistair, can you turn the volume up? Yes, he's doing that, thank you. Can you hear me now? Is everybody okay with the volume? Okay. So, here are some of the women workers that I've found and put into the history calendar. I found women criminals, gang leaders, heads of religious houses, major landowners, farmers, a 17th century bone setter, an apothecary, a tavern keeper, a baker who got caught cheating in Caingham by selling underweight bread loaves, a swineherd letting her pigs out in other people's land and sneaking them out of the pinfold at night. I found a floor layer with a government contract working on Hull's fortifications. The photograph shows Tukulito, a Greenland woman who learnt English from the whalers who stopped there, visited Hull and made her living as a translator. So women are in the historical record, you just have to look for them. So let's start with some famous local women. On the left, Amy Johnson, aircraft engineer and pilot. Women were banned from the engineering shed. She ignored the rule and learnt. The glamorous Dorothy McHale, 30s movie star, born in Hull, became a stage actor in London and Paris before moving to Broadway, and in 1920 made her first film. In 1932, she starred with Humphrey Bogart in Love Affair. And on the right, Barbara Buttrick, who was inducted into the Florida Boxing Hall of Fame in 2010, aged 80. She was born in Cottingham in 1930, began boxing in 1945, married her manager and moved to Florida in 1952, and at 4'11", she was known as the Mighty Atom. She retired from boxing with a record of 30 wins, 1 defeat and 1 draw. And we could add many others, such as Mary Elwell, an artist in her own right, now coming out of her husband Fred's shadow, sculptor Elsie March, musician and composer Ethel Aginska, poet Stevie Smith, etc., etc. And of course, life has always been easier for the rich and powerful. So did medieval noblewomen have an easy time? Howis or Havis inherited the lordship of Holderness, but was a lord in her own right. She outlived all her husbands and her children, but was still a chattel of the king, who could order her to marry in order to put her lands in the power of the king's favourites. A widow was an asset who could be used to further political alliances. She had no choice in the matter of who she married at the wish of the king. After being widowed 3 times, she rebelled and refused to marry again. She had to pay a massive fine for the privilege of 5,000 marks, about £1,700 in 1212. And Queen Henrietta Maria, whose stone is in Bridlington there, King Charles I's queen, had a conventional royal life before the Civil War, when she turned out to have a shrewd political mind and a great deal of courage. She went to Holland to sell the crown jewels to get money for the royalist cause. Returning to England by sea, she landed in Bridlington Quay in 1643. The following morning, she was awoken at 4 a.m. by the sound of cannon fire, as the house she was in was bombarded by parliamentary ships. She sheltered in a ditch until the receding tide moved the guns out of range and continued on her way, eventually meeting up with her husband at York. Other noble women have played a part in East Riding history, several Delapoles and constables among them, and in the 20th century, the Duchess of Kent volunteered as a music teacher at a primary school on Long Hill Estate in Hull for 13 years. There was a period between about 1100 and 1538 when women could have a career, education, and when management and influence were options, as nuns. Here's a glimpse of life inside the walls of a 12th century Gilbertine nunnery in East Yorkshire in Watton. It concerns the case of a young novice placed as a young girl about 4 years of age to be educated in the nunnery and later to become a nun. She was placed there by the Archbishop of York, Murdoch. She took the veil, although it's not clear what choice she had. She had a love affair with a canon in the same house, got pregnant, and the other nuns took savage revenge on both of them. Later, the canon was mutilated, and I'll let you guess how, and the nun was imprisoned to await the birth of her child. She was found by the nuns to have been released from her chains and no longer pregnant. She claimed she'd been visited in a vision by the late Archbishop, and she reproached him for having placed her in the nunnery. Once she'd repented for her conduct, Murdoch released her from her chains and her pregnancy. Now, excluding the rather unhistorical parts of that story, it does tell us that male and female communities in Watton were not rigidly segregated. Contact between the nun and the canon was apparently quite easy. The episode also reveals it may have been common practice for a girl, at least in a Gilbertine convent, to be placed there as a young child at an age before she could have any religious vocation. But of course the story is recorded because it is an exception. So in the 13th century, some religious houses continued to be of mixed gender, and it was more usual for a woman to be the head, like Cecilia of Walkington at Swine, who was succeeded by Josiana of Anlaby. The monasteries allowed women an alternative to poverty and widowhood and a respected position in society. When the monasteries were dissolved, a whole way of life for women was lost. Unlike the monks, they weren't able to take up positions as local clergy. They had to rely on small pensions or return to their families. In the 16th century, Mary Ward niece of the Wright brothers of Welwick, the gunpowder plotters, learnt Latin as a child and became a strong advocate of women's education. She endured many challenges, including crossing the Alps several times on foot and imprisonment, before being able to found the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She was declared venerable in 2009. And Catholic women sometimes proved more steadfast and audacious in their faith than their men. Lady Margaret Constable, shown here, had to sign an agreement to restrict herself to certain parts of Burton Constable Hall. Her son, Sir John, was looking for official posts, and he couldn't afford to be considered a papist, but his mother worshipped openly and was fined as a Catholic recusant for not attending Church of England services. Lady Grace Babthorpe ruined her family by incurring enormous fines and prison sentences for herself and her relatives. Ursula Wright, mother of the Wright brothers, served up to 10 sentences in the notorious prison of Hull. When Marjorie Kemp arrived in Hull in 1417, her reputation as a holy woman preceded her. She was arrested and suspected of being a Lollard heretic, but on being interrogated, her views were accepted as orthodox. What was unorthodox was that she was travelling and preaching the gospel as a woman. She was expelled from Hull, arrested in Hessel, questioned again in Beverley, and told to go and spin wool as other women do. Spinning was clearly something women were expected to do quietly at home. The dangerous heresy of which Lollards were accused included that women had power and authority to preach and make the body of Christ, and they have the power of the keys of the church of binding and loosing. So apart from the nobility and the religious, what were ordinary women doing? We know that the usual way for a man of starting in a trade was to be apprenticed to a master in the chosen trade, usually to live in the master's household for 7 years, and when qualified, to be admitted to the guild for that trade. The guild provided mutual support and regulated the trade. Women rarely had apprenticeships. Women could be members of guilds, though. Many guilds included both men and women, like Hull's Trinity House Guild, formed in 1369 by 49 men and women who bound themselves to help each other in poverty and sickness. However, by 1457, its members were all master mariners and pilots, and therefore all male, as they remain today. Excuse my croaking voice. So, should we assume women were not heads of households, for one thing? It sounds reasonable, except that in 1260 in Holderness, women were recorded as cotters, that is, having a small amount of land and a house in their own name. And those women were not always widow or daughter, but there as single women or heads of household. Some women in Heddon were burgesses, and indeed one of Heddon's medieval streets is named Baxtergate, after the number of women bakers there. The Howden poll tax returns for 1379 recorded 286 heads of households paying tax, of whom 132 were women. There were 20 female brewers and 4 websters. There were 75 servants listed, although many of these were young men and women working with their parents. Blacktoft, at the same date, had only 141 adults, including 10 female brewers, 19 servants, male or female we don't know, and even the small village of Yokefleet, with 82 adults, had 5 female brewers and 10 servants. In Mews Abbey, as early as 1197, it appears that women were being employed on neighbouring estates, and a quote, "Women work as servants in the granges and in the outer court of the abbey. I'm told that women are sometimes paid to care for and teach young orphans. Women were certainly in trade. They sold butter and hats in Beverley Market, even though they were often discriminated against. A female shopkeeper in Beverley who wasn't the widow of a freeman had to pay a premium before she could begin trading. The shipping of raw wool was important in Hull until the 1390s. Women made up only 1% of the shippers, as in other ports, but they were active traders at Hull. Most simply completed their husband's last venture, but Alicia Day was still trading in 1473, 2 years after John Day's death. And Mariona Kent, widow of John Kent of York, was also busy in the same 2 years. The busiest of all was Dionysia Home, widow of John Home of Beverley, who continued to trade as a wool stapler from 1465 until she died in 1471. So we have medieval women working as servants, brewers, smallholders, teachers, and running businesses. So let's have a look. Oh no. Sorry about that, a little glitch. I won't go back to that. I did an audio version some time ago and some of it's stuck. So women in the early modern period. In 17th century Skipsey, Hester Stevenson and Isabella Stevenson were fined 2 and 6 for not contributing 1 wagon and beasts to carry stones and sand to repair the public roads, showing that women were expected to pay equal shares of costs to the community. From the 16th century, the Mangy or Manjoy family traded as goldsmiths in Hull. When Edward Mangy died in 1685, his wife Catherine carried on the business, and silver was produced marked with her initials. When her son joined the trade, they worked together, and her work, as you have seen the picture there, is part of Hull Minster's collection of plate. She died in 1725, aged 88. Yes, it is there. Hull widows are recorded in the 17th century, acting as money lenders, a toll farmer collecting tolls on carts coming into the town. Possibly Widow Wilson was a blacksmith, and the widow Anne Herring definitely was appointed common scavenger in 1662. She had to search through the town with a horse and cart and ask householders who'd left rubbish in the streets to clean it up and carry it off to the town dump. If they didn't do that, she was asked to remove the nuisance herself and report the offender to the mayor, who would levy a fine. And the fines were used to pay Widow Herring's wage of 10 shillings a quarter. Other women, not necessarily widows, were working as spinners, tailors, milliners, dyers, shoemakers, embroiderers, in laundry work, brewing, baking and confectionery, running ferries, and selling food on the street. They could be in domestic service, midwives, thatchers, but not in Hull, which had forbidden thatch as a fire risk by this time, apothecaries, prostitutes. In the 17th century, keeping school was considered an occupation reserved for poor women. During the Civil War, the siege of Hull required all Hull townspeople to help with the defences, including earthworks for a gun emplacement at the Charterhouse site. This was later described as a fort hard by the ruins of the Charterhouse, upon which they planted a great brass gun. A contemporary report says, "They killed a woman servant as she was carrying earth for the raising of the earth, and 100 more of her sex were disheartened and deserted the work. But afterwards all the women, even those of the best rank, stranger and others, willingly helped forward the works." Women did similar work during the Civil War in Bristol, Lyme, Maidstone and other towns. They were also spies, couriers, and writers and disseminators of news and propaganda. After the war, in 1683, labourers were again needed for the Hull fortifications. Captain Lloyd allowed them 14 pence a day because in this time of harvest they may have more wages in the country. There was a shortage of staff. At this time we know that women were also working on these building works, and women were employed as dockside porters in Hull. Captain Lloyd decided the women were allowed 10 pence per day. According to their labour, we think they deserved as well as the men. The board, however, disagreed and said women's wages were not to exceed 4 pence a day, and they were ordered to be dismissed as their employment was a disparagement to His Majesty's service. It's unclear whether these threats were carried out when the problem was one of too few hands. It seems the work got done and the women got paid. And women could hold agricultural land even when they were in service. At Lonsborough House, home of the Clifford Earls of Cumberland, Anthony Atkinson had 4 daughters, 3 of them laundry and dairymaids, who were sharing in 1607 an oxgang of arable land in Shipton. And in 1656 in Caingham, Margaret Ingleby was fined for selling underweight bread loaves in her bakery. 2 years later, in the same village, Elizabeth Verity kept pigs and geese and was fined for letting them trespass and recovered them from the pinfold at night. You might remember in the earlier list of occupations, I mentioned women working as tailors in the 17th century. Something happened. For the next 100 years or so, women tailors were not found. We don't know exactly why, but until the 18th century, it was not considered a suitable occupation for a woman. It seems they were deliberately excluded. So moving on to the 18th and the 19th centuries. In the 18th century, we still find widows and spinsters having shares in Hull ships, but with the Industrial Revolution, work changed. New methods of transport, greater mobility. Women also found a place in the new occupations. After the creation of the canal network, women worked on barges and keels, often accompanying their husband, with the whole family often living on board or joining him for a trip. A quote that women would often haul the keel along with a long rope connected to a post on board, and with a canvas covering on her shoulders, she would pull the keel along, especially if there was no wind. It was known as bow yanking. Factories were also concentrating work, attracting people from outside the immediate area. In Patrington, a flax factory employed about 100 people. One Patrington house had 8 factory women and girls lodging there, so we can assume other women were lodging for work too. Women continued to be employed in a variety of ways. 19th century records show them working in fields in Beverley Road, Hull, and as hawkers, particularly if they were Irish-born. Still in brewing, 19th century Howden had 20 female brewers. And also in 19th century Patrington, Harriet Burnham was a druggist, and Jane Blencarn was employed plumbing and painting. Mary Much in Hessel played fiddle in the church and was paid for singing. Miss Ellis played organ, and a sister ran a school and was paid more than the parish clerk. When in 1848 the Kingston cotton mills workers drowned on a ferry going to work, they were mostly women and children. And women and children were a key part of the economy in the Industrial Revolution. Landlords complained when they couldn't get women to work. In the 18th century, Henry Strickland blamed exorbitant wages for removing women from the workforce. A labourer who's able to maintain his wife and daughters in ease at home will not suffer them as formerly to engage in agricultural labour. Mostly, however, women earned much less than men. The records on the development of orphanages, for instance, show that few of the children they cared for were orphans in the strict modern sense of the word. When a working man died, his wife often could not earn enough to maintain herself and her children. it was poverty, more than lack of both parents, which sent children to orphanages. So the weight of social pressure and expectation reduced women's opportunities, but increasing opportunities for women existed in mid-19th century Hull, in prostitution. Between 1837 and 47, 273 soldiers out of every 1,000 were hospitalised with a sexually transmitted disease. In 1849 alone, 627 women in Hull were charged with prostitution. In 1867, a Royal Commission for the Employment of Children, Young Persons and Women in Agriculture took evidence that women are extensively employed throughout the whole year and their labour is considered essential for the cultivation of the land, cleaning the land, picking stones, weeding, hoeing, haymaking and harvest work, threshing, filling dung carts, spreading dung, turnip cutting, driving carts, harrowing. The universal opinion is that it conduces to health. It was controversial. The sharing of housing by mixed genders was considered indecent and that it put women at moral risk. Education had the capacity to increase or restrict opportunities for women. Schools for girls were generally fewer than for boys, as a lot of effort went into teaching girls sewing, knitting, spinning and domestic service generally, as much as it did into reading, writing and religious study. The earliest industrial school in East Yorkshire was Bowers Knitting School at Bridlington, established in 1671 for the carding and spinning of wool and knitting of all manner of woolen wear. Boys and girls from age 6 to 12 years were eligible, but the school soon seems to have become one for girls. How and why did these skills become female skills only? Secondary education for girls was rare until the 20th century, and university education non-existent, so excluding women from many professions. But business was a possibility. Mrs. Rose carried on her business under her own married name. The Old Foundry provides a unique record in the supply of machinery to all parts of the world when she began the export trade. And in 1868, Mrs. Rose shipped out the first hydraulic oil mill to be used in China. She advertised for a manager, and Mr. James Downes applied, was taken into partnership, and the firm you may have heard of, Rose, Downes and Thompson. So women could also be troublemakers. Around 1260, 10 men and 1 woman were ordered to be arrested for stealing goods belonging to Sarah de Gargrave, a major landowner in Holderness with lands in Heddon and Ottringham. At the date given for the trial, only the woman turned up, Isabel de Fickling. So was it just a criminal gang in a lawless time? The men included a constable, Sir Simon no less, also the provost of Holsham, the sheriff of Holderness, and a certain Robert or Robin Hood. The details of the case are rather complicated, but they come from a time a couple of years after a major rebellion in Holderness against the king, led by the sheriff of Holderness. The Holderness men refused a summons to provide an armed escort to accompany Prince Edward to Scotland. When Edward came back from Scotland, he summoned them again, and they refused again. When the king sent an army against them, the Holderness men destroyed the bridge over the Hull at Ticton to prevent the royal army crossing the river. Now, the Lord of Holderness at that time was the widow Isabella de Force, Countess of Aumale or Albemarle. Among her lands were Holsham and Fickling. It's my suggestion that Isabel Fickling was the same person as Isabella de Force, Lord of Holderness. The court arrested no one else, found no goods, and the case foundered in the courts for years. She was a powerful woman, one of the richest in the country, and a match for the king. and a possible contender for an early Maid Marian figure. So, more troublemakers. You didn't need riches and status to stand up to power in East Yorkshire. There are many examples when local women were in the forefront of action against what they saw as injustice. You may be aware of a long dispute between the town of Hull and its western neighbours over drinking water, which was taken from springs and carried via channels into the town. At times, the dispute became violent, with West Hull villagers polluting the stream and causing damage. In 1316, it was reported to the court that Loretta, late the wife of John de Oostfleet, John his son, and others of Swanland and Westella, broke by night walls and dikes made for the preservation of the king's manor of Myton and his lands, so that his corn and meadows were submerged. In 1538, a witch from Welwick, Mabel Brigg, was hanged for attempting to kill the king and the Duke of Norfolk by means of a black fast. There's a lot more to say about that case, but I do a whole talk on it, so enough for now. But those witches, in 1583, the prisons of Hull were full, and the mayor and aldermen asked the Lord President of the North to sit as judge to try them instead of sending them to York as normal. 3 persons were convicted of felony and suffered the punishment of death, and 3 poor old women were tried for witchcraft, one of whom was sentenced to stand in the pillory on 4 separate market days and to a year's imprisonment. Not as many people think being burnt to death. In 1604 in Hull, a number of people were accused in a special assize court of witchcraft. The record shows that 5 only found guilty and were executed. 3 women, Mary Holland, Janet Butler and Janet Wressell, and 2 men, Roger Beedney and John Willoughby. Also, one of the Salem witches was born in Rowley, East Yorkshire. Elizabeth Howe, born Jackson, left England aged 3. She was hanged as a witch in 1692, but her conviction was quashed in 1710. The key period for witchcraft prosecutions was the 1640s to 1670s. In the whole of Yorkshire in that time, 22 women and 2 men were executed at York for witchcraft. For executions of all crimes, about 10 men were executed for each woman, whereas today's figures show a prison population about 95% male. So, when you hear these stories of everybody being accused of a witch, take it with a little pinch of salt. In 1745, when England was in fear of the Jacobites under Bonnie Prince Charlie, the fear of a Scottish invasion was all too real in Hull. Women joined the men at a meeting at the George Inn, and the volunteers armed themselves with a medley of rustic weapons, including rolling pins and clothes props, and set out in search of the enemy. Women were often in the vanguard when it came to defending men against being impressed into the Navy by the press gang. On one occasion, women working in the fields near the Bull Inn on Beverley Road came to the rescue of a man being pulled from a stagecoach by the press gang. This was a common practice they had of waylaying coaches on their way into town. Waving their hay forks, the women drove off the Navy men, lifted the man onto a carrier's wagon, and escorted him safely as far as Newland. Women are also reported taking an active part in food riots in the hungry times during the Napoleonic Wars. In August 1795, flour prices were raised at Hull Market, and a report says a number of women and boys rampaged along Queen's Dockside, smashing windows. A section of the Surrey militia, then stationed in Hull, was called in to quell the riot. And another serious food riot took place in 1796 on a Tuesday, market day in Hull. Again, it was an increase in the price of flour that led to a large-scale public disturbance. The crowd included many women. They demanded that the market traders should sell their goods at prices they set and the army was again called out to restore order. We've already mentioned the Civil War. During World War I and World War II, women did what were usually considered men's jobs in large numbers to replace men recruited into the forces. In World War I, they acted as munitions workers, police, worked on buses and trams, joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and in their spare time played football, and women's football attracted huge crowds in the war years. In World War I, Dr. Mary Murdoch, Hull's first woman GP, staffed a casualty station during Zeppelin raids. In 1919, most women lost their jobs as men returned from the front. In World War II, women volunteered for the casualty service during the Hull Blitz as fire watchers and wardens. They acted as drivers and attendants, as special constables and auxiliary police, often working during air raids. Young girls acted as messengers, including a girl of 18 who was killed on duty. Billeting officers found accommodation for people bombed out and for builders drafted in to repair bombed buildings. The Women's Voluntary Service operated reception centres, and on the night of May the 7th, 1941, looked after 7,350 people. They found accommodation for all but 400 of them, and the next night they turned out to look after a further 7,000 bombed out. Women from the British Legion and Townswomen's Guild also worked with them. Women postal workers joined the Hull GPO Home Guard unit. And again, when the men returned home, women lost their jobs. And it was the norm in many occupations for women to lose their job when they married. In war, women are generally seen as a pool of labour to be dipped into as required and put away in preference to men when not required. So the patterns of women's work in the past show some noticeable shifts over time. For instance, women worked as tailors and weavers in the medieval period and in the 18th century, but not in the 16th. Neither physical strength nor childbearing can explain why women were excluded from tailoring between 1500 and 1650, but worked successfully and skillfully in this and other closely related crafts in other periods. And by the way, physical strength doesn't explain why women did some physically taxing forms of work and not others, such as why they walked for miles carrying heavy loads on their heads rather than driving carts. When both paid and unpaid work are counted, modern time-use studies show that women do the majority of work, 55% in rural areas of developing countries and 51% in modern industrial countries. Recent research shows that married women often had different occupations from their husbands in the past. If we don't know what women did, we're missing an important part of the economy. For instance, women carried out a third of agricultural work tasks, around half of the work in everyday commerce, and almost 2/3 of work tasks in textile production. Women did do most of the cooking, housework and childcare, but it didn't take up the majority of their working time. Research suggests the majority was done for other households, not as unpaid work for one's own family. Today, the glass ceiling is proving difficult to break, but at least women are visible. And when historians are women, their contribution is less likely to go unrecorded. Thank you.